Hello, welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Our lesson today is a continuation in our in-depth study of First Thessalonians, and it addresses 4 verses, verses 9 through 12 of chapter 4. These verses are labeled in several Bibles or set off as a separate section, titled or subtitled under a heading like brotherly love or words to that effect. But they also contain what some consider commandments about work, minding your own business, and dependency on others. Various Bible translations, however, do not agree on how this should be translated. They sometimes agree on the words, but not on how the words are put together in a sentence. So we will look at these in at least 2 versions to get some idea of how it's heard. So I'll read 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, first in the Revised Standard Version, and secondly in the NIV, and I may note with a period, meaning end of sentence. Reading first from the New Revised Standard Version. Now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anyone write to you, for you yourself have been taught by God to love one another, and indeed you do love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia, period. But we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more, to aspire to living quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands, as we directed you, so that you may behave properly towards outsiders and be dependent on no one, period. So 2 sentences. Now in the NIV, the same verses, 9 through 12. Now about brotherly love, we do not need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other, period. And in fact, you do love all the brothers throughout Macedonia, period. Yet we urge you, brothers, to do so more and more, period. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to do work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody, period. Many scholars suggest these verses are to be understood as part of Paul's concern about Christians, how Christians should live a life of certain, especially relative to moral life, at least living a moral life. Not for the sake of the community or the individual, but for what is pleasing to God and for the sake of the church. And your way of life should set the Christian community apart from the world's behavior. Dr. Beverly Robert Gaventi of Baylor University concludes Paul's most basic assumption here is, we are creatures of God and not at liberty to do as we please. We saw that idea in the moral issues of the first 8 verses also in this chapter 4, and that continues, she says, here in these 4 verses. What is here is not just some mundane rambling of Paul, however, but something he considers to be very important. So he tends to ramble, or what appears to be rambling, but that rambling technique was used to call emphasis in his day and time. He gives several admonitions here in these 4 verses, saying says Dr. Gaventi, but we must pay close attention to how they fit into context and relate to one another through close attention to the language used. Interpretation of these verses may not be as simple as it seems at first appearance on a quick read. For example, the word used for love here in the Greek is Philadelphia, not the same word that's used for love several other places in this book and most places in the New Testament. As we notice, neither do translators agree upon the English wording here. This word love, Philadelphia, is the Greek word there, or at least when we put the Greek word in our vocabulary. It is very specific type of love. The NIV translated it brotherly love, recall, while the New Revised Standard translates it love of brothers and sisters. This word Philadelphia at the time of Paul's writing, scholars say, in both the Greek and the Hebrew literature, almost always was used exclusively for the relationship of siblings within a family. Dr. Charles Wanamaker, one of the well-known theologians and scholars of the book of especially 1 Thessalonians, suggests that it is how Paul is using it here also, but he's using it in a metaphoric manner. Therefore, to understand the metaphor's extension here, we need to carefully unpack this reference to what came before it and what follows it. Other scholars say for us not to lose the sibling within family connection, as that is critical here. Paul says basically that I do not need to write to you about sibling love, maybe one way to express it. Especially sibling love for one another. All right, that would probably be a better translation. Because, he says, and he gives up a cause, that because it's followed by an assumption that they have been taught by God to love each other. How is he meaning God here? Several scholars ask this question. We seldom stop and ask that question. Recall, he identified God as our Father just in the previous 8 verses at the end and at the end of chapter 3. Thus, scholars say Paul is using that claim here in chapter 4. That is, that the Christians are a family headed by God, is the assumption that Paul has. God's family, if you will. That Father taught you to love one another in the family, assuming they understood it to mean just like any other family in their society, in their Macedonian society. It was the father's role to teach children to love one another. Paul does not tell them how God taught them, because he didn't need to. Many people attack this because Paul doesn't tell them, well, how did God teach these people? It's because he's not saying he physically taught them, but it's God's message that they were taught. And in this case, since he's using the metaphoric family, that's God the Fatherhead, it is the role of the Father to teach. That's the implication here. Because he is only using Father's role in teaching of the family how to love. That's the issue here. It is an implied understanding of the Father's role in the Macedonian, Greek, and Jewish families of the time. Paul also acknowledges he does not have to address this as they have already demonstrated their Philadelphia type love for one another. And then he sticks on a kicker, in all of Macedonia. But he then adds, you must do more, or more and more. Some scholars suggest that by mentioning all of Macedonia, Paul may be touching on a very sensitive issue of the brotherly love that is still needed by this group. In other words, he's implying maybe that they need to go beyond their ethnic group. Christianity is not a religion of one ethnic group, such as some of the pagan faiths that they come from, and Judaism. They need to accept the concept that mutual love is necessary for one another in the Christian community, and it's got to be outside any restrictions of regionality, nationality, race, ethnicity, etc. Dr. Charles Wanamaker also suggests that Paul's emphasis here of mutual love for all Christians was intended to create a new sense of identity and mutual commitment within the church community that was necessary for survival. Understanding that concept, without a Judeo-Christian God and Christ, there had not been a cultural basis for these people to have thought beyond that. Because in their situation, they were allowed to remain very isolated relative to their various pagan faiths. Even though another community may have a god of thunder, etc., they called it different, they worshiped him different, worshiped that god different, and so forth. You are not just in a family of Thessalonians or Macedonian Christians, but Christians of all ethnicities and nations are going to be involved or already involved based on their limited understanding of the world at the time. So he exhorts them to show it in verse 10 there. Dr. Carol Osick, who is, and Dr. Green, Dr. Osick, I haven't used her in 1 Thessalonians before. She's of the Catholic faith, taught for many years at the Catholic Seminary in Chicago, and then she was more recently, as a recent professor emeritus, retired from Bright School of Divinity in Texas Christian University. Very respected. She and Dr. Green, Dr. Green is much more of the evangelical leaning, note that the Thessalonians were subject to social rejection due to their new faith. Thus, there was a real need for stability of Christians within their own community, because they had lost most of their community, and their community was being ostracized. Shunned, if you will, is a word she used. Establishing mutual love among members, therefore, would have been necessary because of this social rejection elsewhere in the community. There was a real need for the church to assume the function of a family, a community family, if you will, especially as it turned towards private meetings in the home. In order to escape some of this. Moreover, there was a need within each congregation, since it was open to social classes and all social classes and ethnic groups. These people are now going to be coming in your home if it's a church meeting, and you're to welcome all of them. For example, there is evidence in Macedonian area, not so much necessarily just in Thessalonica, but the Macedonian churches, that there were slaves and free, there were rich and poor, Greeks, Romans, Macedonians, Jews, and even some what would be considered barbarian, Germanics, if you will, all gathering together and to share the same cup for worship. So such a community would clearly need to develop brotherly or sibling or fraternal type love, any of those words could apply, for one another in order to survive in this close setting and still maintain love. You could not say, well, you can't come and take the cup in my house because you are poor, or you can't come and take the cup in my house because you are a barbarian by race. Dr. Wanamaker also makes a point that the exhortation to love the family of God is followed by three infinitive phrases, if you will, that are tied to it. And that tends to get lost in some of the translations. They don't hold to that necessarily. These get much debate also in the church community, that is, the message that's buried within them, and they raise lots of concern among denominations and various congregations. Several of the scholars at this point address these issues, bringing the idea that maybe how part of what's driving this at this point is competing moral standards among various groups that have pretty high moral standards overall in the Thessalonica community there. The two most often mentioned are Epicureans and Gnostics. So maybe we should look just briefly at them a little bit. The Epicureans followed a Greek philosopher from 300 years before, who taught a philosophy and had high, what was considered high virtuous values. This group held that the key virtue was Philadelphia, that is, brotherly or sibling type love for one another. Fraternal love, it was often referred to. But they lived a very different lifestyle from Christians. They taught that all gods, little g's, as well as big G, and death were not to be feared, as none of them had any influence over humanity or its physical elements. They rejected immortality of the soul and life after death. They believed life was to be lived so as to maximize pleasure, simply in a way that also avoided physical and mental stress. What a daydream, one scholar says. Seeking refinement in food, drink, and sensual and sexual pleasures that minimize work seemed to be their goal. They likely would have suggested to the Christians in an argument that, well, if you all think that this Christ of yours is going to immediately return, why are you working at all? The Gnostics had many similar beliefs to the Epicureans, but some of them were actually Christians. There are various sects of Gnostics. Thus, some scholars suggest this group may have been influencing the Thessalonians concerning the end time, especially the very near, basically the same concept that if you all believe that it's very near the end, and if you really believe that and stand up for that, why work? Let the end happen. So, thus, why work may be the core issue here. That this is surfaced. That they think they're so close to the end that there's no need to prepare for tomorrow. And that's being used against them, maybe. Others say these exhortations become clearer when they're added, when verse 11 is added there. Tend or mind your own business, so to speak. Likely means, some suggest, that stay out of the business of these other groups and listen to these other groups. Listen and follow what the apostles have taught you. not be listening to these offshoot organizations. Yes, stay busy and work with your own hands, which was the type work that was available in those days and times for the average Joe. That these groups teach is good. There's nothing wrong with that aspect of what they're teaching, maybe the apostles are saying here. But leave their religious doctrine alone. If you stay busy, you will not become idle and get yourself into theological trouble and thinking outside the box, so to speak. Just because they have some good moral ideas, one scholar said, did not mean that you should adopt the rest of their system and lifestyle. Adopt the values that the apostles have taught you is the concept here, many scholars suggest. Most scholars issue some sort of a warning here and argue that in no way, though, that it seems to imply that this is a commandment against manual labor. To do manual labor, against any labor that's not manual. Which some churches and congregations espouse and use this as the scripture to back it up. But the scholars are strongly against that interpretation. This may have been urged on some. There may have been a problem also, of course, that there were some lazy individuals that were in the congregation, and so it's also could serve as a warning to them, but by no means does it appear to be, most scholars say, the primary warning. But in that point, several scholars suggest that we have to appreciate that the eschatological expectations that were here in Paul's time was that Christ is going to come any day, going to return any day. They expected it very, very soon. And so if that, we now have the hindsight of 2,000 years that it's not happened. Consequently, we tend to look a little farther down the road. But people at that time and space were thinking it really is right now. And so there obviously probably were a few that think that it's going to be tomorrow morning, so why should I work today? Martin Luther, 1,600 years later than Paul, liked to preach on this issue, some scholars have noted. He addressed it in an issue he called fervent hope. Yes, it's fine to have fervent hope, but he then always would close with this statement, they said. It is reported that his message would be, if I knew that the world would end tomorrow, I would still plant an apple tree today. He felt that's how you should live your life there. I think that does add some perspective to the issue here. This is how the scholars tend to look at this, at least the 5 scholars that I'm using right now. Maybe that'll give you some idea of how they see it, but understand this is a controversial set of scriptures here, especially those exhortations there at the end. I hope this gives you some idea of how they see it, and hope you have a good Bible study, and see you next week.